The dust swirled in angry clouds across the barren plains of Texas, as Quentin Tucker pulled his worn leather hat lower over his eyes, squinting at the horizon where the setting sun painted the sky in hues of crimson and gold. He'd been riding for 3 days straight, his body aching from hours in the saddle, his throat parched from the relentless heat of the summer of 1878. The cattle drive had ended early after losing half the herd to rustlers near the Colorado border. And now, with nothing but $2 in his pocket and a weary horse beneath him, Quentin found himself heading nowhere in particular. At 32, he was no stranger to disappointment. Life as a cowboy meant embracing the unpredictable nature of existence on the frontier. Sometimes you won, most times you lost, but you kept riding all the same. He'd long ago stopped expecting more from life than what each day brought: food when he could find it, shelter when the weather turned, and work when luck was on his side. The distant silhouette of a small settlement appeared on the horizon as twilight deepened. Not much of a town from the looks of it, probably just a general store, a saloon, and a handful of weathered buildings clinging to existence in this unforgiving landscape. Still, it meant a potential meal and maybe a bed that wasn't the hard ground if he could find some quick work. As Quentin approached the outskirts of what he now saw was barely more than a dusty crossroads, an unusual sound caught his attention. At first, he thought it might be the wind playing tricks, but as he drew closer, the sound clarified into something that made him pull on his reins: a child's cry. He frowned, scanning the landscape. Out here, a child alone meant trouble. The wailing continued, a pitiful sound that seemed to emanate from behind a cluster of scrubby mesquite trees about 50 yards off the trail. Quentin hesitated only a moment before turning his horse toward the sound. "Hello," he called out, his voice rough from disuse and dust. "Anyone there?" The crying continued unabated. Dismounting, Quentin tied his horse to a scraggly tree and approached cautiously, his hand resting instinctively on the revolver at his hip. In these parts, caution was what kept a man alive. What he found behind those trees was no trap, but instead a small boy, perhaps 3 or 4 years old, sitting in the dirt, face streaked with tears and dust, clothes tattered and filthy. The child looked up at Quentin's approach, his crying momentarily paused as he regarded the stranger with wide, frightened eyes. "Hey there, little fella," Quentin said, crouching down to appear less threatening. "What are you doing out here all by yourself?" The boy's lip quivered and fresh tears spilled down his dirt-streaked face. "Mama," was all he managed to say before dissolving into sobs again. Quentin looked around, seeing no sign of anyone else. No wagon tracks, no footprints besides the small ones of the child. Nothing to indicate how this boy had come to be alone in the middle of nowhere as night approached. "Where is your mama?" Quentin asked gently. The boy pointed vaguely toward the town. "Bad men," he whispered, his voice trembling. An uneasy feeling settled in Quentin's gut. He'd seen enough of the frontier's dark side to understand what that might mean. Outlaws, renegades, men who took what they wanted without concern for who got hurt in the process. "What's your name, son?" Quentin asked, removing his bandana to wipe some of the dust from the boy's face. "Samuel," the child whispered. "All right, Samuel, I'm Quentin. You can call me Quinn if that's easier." He surveyed the darkening landscape, knowing he couldn't leave the boy out here alone with night falling. "How about you come with me into town? We'll find something to eat and then we'll look for your mama." "Does that sound all right?" Samuel nodded hesitantly, his small body still trembling. With a gentleness that belied his weathered exterior, Quentin lifted the child into his arms. The boy was too light, and immediately wrapped his arms around Quentin's neck, clinging to him like a lifeline. Something protective stirred in Quentin's chest, a feeling he hadn't experienced in a long time. "It's going to be all right, Samuel," he murmured, though he had no way of knowing if that was true. "I've got you now." Carrying Samuel back to his horse, Quentin mounted carefully, settling the child securely in front of him in the saddle. The boy remained silent, but his death grip on Quentin's arm spoke volumes about his fear. As they rode slowly toward the town, Quentin found himself praying for the first time in years. Not the desperate bargaining prayers of a man facing death, but something simpler, more genuine. "Lord," he whispered, too quietly for the child to hear, "help me find this boy's mother, and if she's gone, then help me know what to do." The settlement Quentin now saw a weathered sign identifying it as Cottonwood Springs, consisted of a main street lined with a dozen buildings, most looking as if they'd seen better days. A few oil lamps cast yellow pools of light into the growing darkness, and the tinny sound of a piano drifted from what was clearly the town's saloon. Quentin headed for the general store first, hoping to find someone who might know the boy or his mother. As he dismounted, still holding Samuel, the door to the store opened and an older man with spectacles stepped out. "We're closing up for," the man stopped short, staring at Quentin and the child in his arms. "What's this now?" "Found this boy alone out by the trail," Quentin explained. "Says his name is Samuel. Mentioned something about his mother and bad men. You know anything about that?" The storekeeper's expression darkened. "You'd best come inside," he said, holding the door open. "Name's Harold Miller. I own this establishment." Inside the store, an oil lamp cast warm light over shelves stocked with provisions. Miller gestured for Quentin to sit on a wooden chair near the counter, then disappeared briefly into the back room, returning with a cup of water for the boy. Samuel drank thirstily while Miller studied him with a frown. "That's the Reynolds boy, sure enough," Miller said finally. "Grace Reynolds and her son arrived here about 3 months ago. She took work at the boarding house, cooking and cleaning, kept to herself mostly but was always polite. Good woman by all accounts." "And where is she now?" Quentin asked, though he dreaded the answer. Miller sighed heavily. 3 men rode into town yesterday, rough types, said they were looking for a woman matching Mrs. Reynolds' description. When they found her at the boarding house, there was some kind of commotion. Mrs. Winters, she runs the place, said Mrs. Reynolds seemed frightened, tried to run. They grabbed her, forced her onto a horse. No one intervened. Those men were armed to the teeth and made it clear they'd shoot anyone who got in their way. Quentin felt Samuel tense in his arms. The boy was left behind, must have been hiding. Mrs. Winters went looking for him after, but couldn't find him anywhere, we figured. Miller trailed off, glancing uncomfortably at Samuel. "You figured he'd been taken too," Quentin finished. "Or worse," Miller admitted quietly. Samuel buried his face against Quentin's chest. "Want mama," he mumbled, fresh tears dampening Quentin's already dusty shirt. "Any idea who those men were or where they might have taken her?" Quentin asked. Miller shook his head. "Strangers to me, headed north when they left, for what that's worth." "But listen, Mr. Tucker, Quentin Tucker." "Tucker then, this ain't your concern. The sheriff's due back tomorrow or the next day. He'll handle it." Quentin looked down at the child in his arms, feeling the small body shake with silent sobs. "And what happens to the boy in the meantime?" "Mrs. Winters would take him in, I'm sure. She's a kind soul." Quentin nodded slowly, though something told him the matter was far from settled. "We'll need a place to stay tonight then, and some food for the boy." Miller hesitated, then reached beneath the counter and produced a small paper sack. "Some bread and jerky, on the house. Boarding house is 2 buildings down on the right. Tell Mrs. Winters I sent you." Quentin thanked him, rose with Samuel still in his arms, and headed for the door. As he stepped back into the cool night air, Miller called after him. "Tucker, those men, they weren't just outlaws. They had the look of hired guns, professional types." Quentin nodded grimly. "I understand." The boarding house was a 2-story structure with a small porch and curtained windows glowing with lamplight. Before Quentin could even knock, the door swung open to reveal a plump woman in her 50s, her gray hair pulled back in a severe bun. "I saw you coming up the walk," she said, her eyes immediately fixing on Samuel. "Oh, thank heavens, you found the boy." She stepped aside, gesturing for Quentin to enter. "I'm Edith Winters. I run this establishment." Once inside, Mrs. Winters insisted on taking Samuel to the kitchen, where she promptly set about feeding him warmed-up stew while Quentin explained how he'd found the child. The boy ate ravenously, seeming to take comfort in the familiar surroundings. "Poor lamb," Mrs. Winters murmured, watching Samuel. "His mother is such a lovely young woman. Quiet, hardworking, never said much about her past, but I gathered she was running from something or someone." "Miller mentioned men taking her," Quentin said. "Did she ever indicate who might be after her?" Mrs. Winters shook her head. Not directly. Once, after receiving a letter that upset her terribly, she said something about her late husband's business partners being dangerous men. That's all I know. Quentin watched as Samuel's eyelids began to droop, exhaustion finally overtaking fear. "The boy needs sleep," he said, "and I'll need a room for the night." "Of course," Mrs. Winters said. "You can have Grace's old room. It's small, but there's a bed for you and a trundle for Samuel." As Mrs. Winters led them upstairs, Samuel reached for Quentin's hand, his small fingers wrapping trustingly around Quentin's larger ones. The simple gesture stirred something in Quentin that he thought had long since died, a desire to protect, to make things right. The room was indeed small but clean, with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a small dresser. A few personal items remained: a hairbrush, a faded photograph in a simple frame, a worn Bible on the nightstand. Evidence of a life interrupted. Quentin helped Samuel change into a nightshirt Mrs. Winters provided, then tucked the exhausted child into the trundle bed. The boy was asleep almost instantly, one hand curled beneath his cheek, the other still clutching Quentin's finger. Gently extracting himself, Quentin moved to examine the few possessions Grace Reynolds had left behind. The photograph showed a younger Grace with a serious-looking man in a business suit, presumably her late husband. She was beautiful, with delicate features and eyes that seemed to hold both warmth and sadness. Quentin found himself wondering what her voice sounded like, what made her laugh, what had driven her to this remote outpost with her young son. Setting down the photograph, he picked up the Bible, noticing a folded paper tucked between its pages. Opening it, he found what appeared to be a letter, dated just 2 weeks earlier. "Gee, they know where you are. Jameson and Powell have hired guns coming for what they believe is theirs. Take the boy and run farther west. Don't tell anyone where you're going. I'll try to throw them off your trail." Quentin frowned, folding the letter and replacing it in the Bible. Clearly, Grace Reynolds had not heeded this warning in time, but it gave him something more to go on than he'd had before. Looking at the sleeping child, Quentin knew what he had to do. Sheriff or no sheriff, he couldn't sit idle while this boy's mother remained in danger. Tomorrow, he would begin tracking the men who had taken Grace Reynolds. As he lay on the narrow bed, staring at the darkened ceiling, Quentin found himself praying again. This time, he prayed not just for guidance, but for strength to find this woman, to reunite mother and child, and to face whatever dangers lay ahead. Morning came with pale light filtering through thin curtains and the smell of coffee and bacon wafting up from the kitchen below. Samuel stirred, his eyes opening wide with momentary confusion before settling on Quentin. "Mama," he asked hopefully. "Not yet, partner," Quentin said gently, sitting on the edge of the trundle bed. "But we're going to find her, I promise you that." After a breakfast during which Samuel ate with surprising appetite, Quentin sat with Mrs. Winters while the boy played quietly with a wooden horse someone had given him. "I'm going after her," Quentin said simply. Mrs. Winters looked alarmed. "But the sheriff might be days away, and even then, what can one lawman do against hired guns? No, I'm not waiting," he hesitated. "But I need your help. I can't take Samuel with me, it's too dangerous. Would you keep him safe until I return?" The older woman's expression softened as she looked at the child. "Of course I will. He's a dear boy, and I've grown fond of him these past months." She turned back to Quentin, her eyes sharp. "But who are you, Mr. Tucker? Why would you risk your life for strangers?" It was a fair question, one Quentin had asked himself during the long night. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "But I found that boy crying in the dust, and when I lifted him up, something changed, like I was meant to find him." He shook his head, embarrassed by his own sentimentality. "Besides, I've got nothing better to do, and I've faced worse odds." Mrs. Winters studied him for a long moment. "Grace is worth saving," she said finally. "She's a good mother and a kind soul. Whatever trouble found her, I don't believe for a minute she deserved it." "I need to know everything you can tell me about her," Quentin said. "Anything that might help me find her." Over the next hour, Mrs. Winters shared what little she knew about Grace Reynolds. She had arrived in Cottonwood Springs with just one trunk and her son, taking the position at the boarding house in exchange for room, board, and a small wage. She had mentioned coming from St. Louis and being recently widowed. She kept to herself but was unfailingly kind to everyone she encountered. She received mail occasionally, always growing tense when letters arrived. There was one more thing, Mrs. Winters added. She wore a locket, never took it off. Once when I commented on it, she said it contained a map to something her husband's partners would kill for. I thought she was being dramatic at the time. Quentin absorbed this information, turning it over in his mind. The men who took her, can you describe them? 3 of them, as I said. The leader was tall, wore a black hat with a silver band, had a scar across his right cheek, cold eyes. The others were just hired muscle from the look of them. Quentin nodded. A man with a scarred face would be easier to track and identify. One more thing, Mrs. Winters said hesitantly. Before they left, I heard the leader say something about taking her to the old mining camp. Does that mean anything to you? There are abandoned mining camps all through these territories, Quentin said, but it's a start. He rose to his feet. I need to explain to Samuel that I'll be leaving, but that I'm going to bring his mother back. The conversation with Samuel was harder than Quentin anticipated. The boy's eyes welled with tears at the news that Quentin would be leaving him behind. You come back? Samuel asked, his voice small. Quentin knelt before him. I will, Samuel, and I'll bring your mama with me, that's a promise. The boy threw his arms around Quentin's neck, holding on tightly. Be careful of the bad men, he whispered. I will, Quentin assured him, feeling a lump form in his throat. It had been a long time since anyone had cared whether he lived or died, and the boy's concern touched him deeply. Before departing, Quentin visited the town's lone gunsmith to stock up on ammunition and gather information about abandoned mining camps in the region. The gunsmith, a grizzled veteran of the Mexican War named Jenkins, proved surprisingly knowledgeable. 3 main camps within a day's ride north of here, he said, marking them on a rough map. Prosperity, that was a silver operation abandoned 73 when the vein played out. Eagle Mountain gold mine dried up 75, and Broken Ridge, that was the biggest operation, copper mainly. Company went bust after some kind of accident in 76, killed a dozen men. Any of them likely to provide shelter for men holding a prisoner? Quentin asked. Jenkins stroked his beard thoughtfully. Broken Ridge would be my guess. Main shaft had offices, bunkhouses, even a cookhouse. Most of it's probably still standing. Remote 2 good 10 miles from the nearest homestead. Armed with this information, fresh supplies, and a determination that surprised even himself, Quentin prepared to depart. Mrs. Winters packed him food for the journey, and Samuel presented him with the wooden horse. For good luck, the boy said solemnly. I'll take good care of it, Quentin promised, tucking the toy into his saddlebag, and I'll bring it back to you along with your mama. With a final farewell, Quentin mounted his horse and rode north out of Cottonwood Springs, following the trail left by the men who had taken Grace Reynolds. The tracks were mostly obscured by the passage of other travelers and a brief rainfall the previous night, but Quentin had spent years reading sign as a scout for the army before turning to cattle driving. Here and there, he found evidence confirming he was on the right path, a distinctive horseshoe print with a chip in the left front shoe. The remains of a cigar of a type not commonly found in these parts. A discarded whiskey bottle of a brand he'd seen in St. Louis, but rarely elsewhere. The terrain grew increasingly rugged as he rode northward, the flat plains giving way to rocky foothills. By midday, Quentin spotted the distant silhouette of what could only be Broken Ridge, a jagged formation that resembled a snapped spine against the sky. The abandoned mining camp would lie at its base. Approaching cautiously as the sun began its westward descent, Quentin left his horse tethered in a sheltered gully half a mile from the camp and proceeded on foot. The camp itself sprawled across a natural plateau, a ghost town of weathered wooden buildings arranged around what had once been the main shaft. As Jenkins had described, there were bunkhouses, a cookhouse, an office building, and various outbuildings, all showing signs of hasty abandonment and subsequent decay. But the camp was not completely abandoned. Smoke rose from the chimney of what appeared to be the former foreman's house, a 2-story structure set slightly apart from the other buildings. And in front of it, 3 horses were tethered to a hitching post. Quentin crouched behind a tumble-down shed, studying the layout and considering his options. A frontal approach would be suicide. He was outnumbered, and these men were professional killers. He needed to gather more information and wait for darkness to gain the advantage of surprise. As the shadows lengthened, Quentin circled the perimeter of the camp, staying hidden among rocks and abandoned equipment. From a new vantage point, he could see into one of the windows of the foreman's house. What he saw made his blood run cold. Grace Reynolds, for it could only be her, with her delicate features matching the photograph he'd seen, sat tied to a chair in what appeared to be the main room. Her face was bruised, her clothing torn, but her expression was one of defiance rather than defeat. She was speaking, apparently arguing with someone out of Quentin's line of sight. A moment later, a man stepped into view, tall, wearing a black hat with a silver band, a livid scar across his right cheek. He leaned down, saying something to Grace that made her turn her face away. The man grabbed her chin roughly, forcing her to look at him. Quentin's hand tightened on his revolver. He had to get closer, had to hear what was being said, had to find a way in. But rushing in blindly would only get them both killed. As night fell fully, Quentin made his move, creeping closer to the house under cover of darkness. The windows were open to the summer night air, allowing snippets of conversation to drift out. "The locket, Grace, that's all we want." This from the scarred man. "I told you, James, I don't have it anymore." Grace's voice was strained but steady. "Don't lie to me." The sound of a slap followed by a gasp of pain. "Powell is running out of patience. The map in that locket is worth a fortune, and your husband stole it from us." "Robert discovered that mine rightfully belonged to the Apache," Grace shot back. "The deed Powell holds is fraudulent, and you know it. That's why you killed him, isn't it? Because he was going to expose your scheme." Another slap. "Your husband died in a riding accident, very unfortunate." "He was murdered," Grace said, her voice breaking slightly. "Just as you'll murder me once you have what you want. Not if you cooperate. Give us the locket, and maybe, just maybe, you get to see your son again." At the mention of Samuel, Quentin saw Grace's composure crack. "My son," she whispered. "What have you done with him?" The scarred man James laughed. "Nothing yet, but my men are searching for him. When they find him." He left the threat hanging. Quentin had heard enough. These men wouldn't hesitate to kill both Grace and her son once they got what they wanted. He needed to act now. Circling to the back of the house, Quentin found a door leading to what might have been a kitchen. It was locked, but the wood around the latch had rotted. With a careful application of pressure, he managed to break it open quietly. Inside, the house was dimly lit by oil lamps. Quentin could hear voices from the front room, James, and at least one other man. Moving silently through the kitchen, he positioned himself in the hallway leading to the main room, peering around the corner. Grace remained tied to the chair. James stood nearby, while a second man, heavyset, with a bushy beard, leaned against the wall, cleaning his fingernails with a knife. A third man was presumably outside, standing guard. Quentin weighed his options. Taking out two armed men in a confined space would be challenging, but not impossible if he had the element of surprise. Drawing his revolver, he took a deep breath, then stepped into the doorway, gun raised. "Evening, gentlemen," he said calmly. "I believe you have something that doesn't belong to you." The reaction was immediate. The bearded man lunged for his gun, but Quentin was faster, firing once. The shot took the man in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him to the floor, his gun clattering away. James had already drawn his weapon, but hesitated when Quentin shifted his aim directly to his head. "Who the hell are you?" he demanded. "Name's Quentin Tucker. I found a boy crying in the dust outside Cottonwood Springs. Seems he's missing his mother." Grace's eyes widened. "Samuel, you found Samuel. Is he safe?" "He's safe," Quentin assured her, not taking his eyes off James. "Mrs. Winters is looking after him." "You're making a big mistake, Cowboy," James said, his gun still pointed at Quentin. "This isn't your fight." "It became my fight when you left a child alone in the wilderness to die," Quentin replied, his voice hardening. "Now lower your weapon, or I'll put a bullet between your eyes." For a tense moment, no one moved. Then, from behind Quentin, came the unmistakable sound of a gun being cocked. "Drop it, mister, or I drop you," came a new voice, the third man, who must have heard the commotion and entered through the kitchen. Quentin froze, caught in an impossible position. If he turned to shoot the man behind him, James would shoot him. If he shot James, the man behind him would shoot him. "Seems we're at an impasse," James said with a smirk. "Now be a good cowboy and drop your gun." Quentin's mind raced, searching for a way out. As he weighed his options, Grace suddenly shouted, "Behind you, James." It was a desperate ploy, but it worked. James instinctively glanced over his shoulder, giving Quentin the split second he needed. He dropped to one knee, firing at James even as he twisted to aim at the man behind him. His first shot caught James in the chest, sending him staggering backward. His second went wide as the man behind him fired, the bullet grazing Quentin's arm. Ignoring the burning pain, Quentin fired again, this time finding his mark. The third man collapsed with a grunt. James was still on his feet, blood spreading across his shirt, his gun wavering as he struggled to aim. "You're dead," he gasped. "Not today," Quentin replied, firing one final shot. As James fell, Quentin quickly checked that all three men were incapacitated, then hurried to Grace. "Are you hurt?" he asked, cutting her bonds with his knife. "Nothing serious," she said, rubbing her wrists where the ropes had chafed them raw. "But we need to hurry, there may be more of them nearby." "Can you ride?" Quentin asked, helping her to her feet. "Yes," she said, then swayed slightly. Though perhaps not well at the moment, Quentin supported her with his uninjured arm. "My horse is hidden about half a mile from here. We'll take one of theirs too, ride double if we have to." As they moved toward the door, Grace suddenly stopped. "Wait," she said, turning back to James's motionless body. Kneeling beside him, she reached into his pocket and extracted a small silver key. "We need this." "What is it?" Quentin asked as they hurried outside. "The key to my locket," Grace explained. "James took it from me when they caught me, but without knowing what he was looking for, he couldn't open it." They took two of the horses tethered outside, leaving one for the wounded man who might survive. Quentin helped Grace mount, then swung up behind her, grimacing as the movement sent pain shooting through his injured arm. "You're wounded," Grace said, noticing his reaction. "It's just a graze," Quentin assured her. "Nothing that won't wait until we're safe." They rode away from the mining camp at a careful pace, wary of attracting attention if there were indeed more of Powell's men in the area. Once they reached Quentin's horse, he tied the second mount to follow behind and helped Grace onto his own horse, mounting behind her. "We'll head south," he said, "but not directly back to Cottonwood Springs. If there are others looking for you, that's the first place they'll check." Grace nodded, leaning back slightly against his chest, her exhaustion evident. "There's a place," she said, "about 20 miles southeast of here. A small canyon with a spring. My husband and I camped there once before Samuel was born. No one would think to look for us there." "Can you find it in the dark?" Quentin asked. "I think so. It's near a distinctive rock formation shaped like a hand." They rode through the night, making slow but steady progress. Grace directed them, her voice growing weaker as the hours passed. Quentin could feel her trembling occasionally, whether from cold, fear, or delayed shock, he couldn't tell. He wanted nothing more than to stop and let her rest, but knew they needed distance between themselves and the mining camp. Eventually, as the eastern sky began to lighten with the first hint of dawn, they reached the canyon Grace had described. A natural spring bubbled up among rocks, creating a small pool before trickling away down the canyon floor. Sheltered by towering cliff walls and hidden from casual observation, it was an ideal place to rest and recover. Quentin helped Grace dismount, then tended to the horses while she sank wearily onto a flat rock beside the spring. When he returned to her, she was washing the dirt and dried blood from her face and arms. "Let me see your arm," she said, gesturing to the bloodstain on his sleeve. "It can wait," he began, but she shook her head. "I insist. You saved my life, Mr. Tucker. The least I can do is tend to your wound." Reluctantly, Quentin removed his shirt, revealing a shallow furrow across his upper arm where the bullet had grazed him. Grace cleaned it with water from the spring, then tore a strip from her petticoat to bind it. "It's not deep," she said, working efficiently. "But even minor wounds can fester out here." "You seem to know something about tending injuries," Quentin observed. A sad smile touched her lips. "My father was a doctor. He taught me the basics before he passed." As she finished bandaging his arm, Quentin studied her face in the growing light. Despite the bruises and the dirt, she was even more beautiful than her photograph had suggested. Her eyes, he now saw, were a deep green, intelligent and direct when they met his. "Thank you," he said simply. "I should be thanking you," she replied. "You risked your life for a woman and child you'd never met." "Why?" Quentin considered the question. "When I found your son, he was terrified, alone. Something about the way he looked at me. I couldn't just ride away." He paused. "And then, learning about you, I felt, I don't know, like I was meant to help." Grace studied him for a long moment. Most men would have left him with Mrs. Winters and continued on their way. "I'm not most men, I guess," Quentin said with a slight shrug. "No," Grace agreed softly. "You're not." They rested through the morning, taking turns keeping watch. Grace slept fitfully, occasionally calling out Samuel's name in her sleep. Quentin watched over her, feeling a protectiveness that went beyond the duty he'd taken on. When she awoke around midday, he had coffee brewing over a small, smokeless fire and was heating some of the provisions Mrs. Winters had provided. "You mentioned Powell," Quentin said as they ate. "Is that the same Powell from the letter I found in your Bible?" Grace looked startled. "You read the letter. I was looking for clues to help find you," Quentin explained. "I'm sorry if that was presumptuous." She shook her head. "No, I understand. Yes, Howard Powell. He was my husband's business partner. They owned several mining operations together, including one that supposedly contained a rich vein of gold. Robert discovered that the land actually belonged to the Apache through an old treaty, and that Powell had falsified documents to claim it. And the locket contains a map to this mine." Grace nodded, reaching into the bodice of her dress to withdraw a silver locket on a chain. "Powell doesn't know exactly what's in here. He only knows Robert hid something important from him." She inserted the small key she had taken from James, turned it, and opened the locket. Inside was not a conventional map, but a series of tiny numbers and symbols etched into the silver. "Coordinates," Grace explained. "And a cipher that, when decoded, provides landmarks to locate the mine entrance. Robert was clever. Even if Powell got the locket, he wouldn't be able to interpret it without the key to the cipher. And you have this key, in my mind." Grace tapped her temple. "Robert taught it to me before he died, was killed." "So Powell won't stop looking for you," Quentin said grimly. "No, not until he has the locket and the cipher's key, or until he's dead." She closed the locket, returning it to its hiding place. "That's why I was running. I thought Cottonwood Springs was remote enough that he wouldn't find me, at least until I could figure out what to do next." "What will you do now?" Quentin asked. Grace looked away, her expression troubled. "I don't know, keep running, I suppose, find somewhere even more remote. But eventually, he'll find me again. Unless we stop him," Quentin said. Grace turned to him, eyes widening. "What do you mean? Powell sent hired guns after you once. He'll do it again. The only way to truly end this is to confront him directly with evidence of his crimes." "That's insanely dangerous," Grace protested. "Powell is a powerful man with connections to judges, politicians, even territorial officials." "Maybe so," Quentin agreed, "but powerful men can fall too if the evidence against them is strong enough." He leaned forward. "You said your husband discovered proof that Powell falsified documents. What happened to that proof?" Grace hesitated. "Robert hid it, said it was safer if I didn't know where." "But you have an idea, don't you?" She sighed. I think he may have hidden it at the mine itself." "He mentioned once that the truth was buried where the lie began." Quentin considered this. "Then that's where we need to go. Find the proof, then take it to a federal marshal, someone beyond Powell's influence." "You make it sound so simple," Grace said, a hint of bitterness in her voice. "My husband tried that route. It got him killed." "Your husband was alone," Quentin pointed out. "You're not anymore." Grace studied him, uncertainty and hope warring in her expression. "You barely know me, Mr. Tucker. Why would you take on my fight?" Quentin wasn't entirely sure himself. All he knew was that since finding Samuel in the dust, something had changed inside him. He'd spent years drifting, taking odd jobs, moving on when things got complicated. But now, the thought of riding away from Grace and Samuel felt impossible. "Because it's the right thing to do," he said finally. "And because—" he hesitated, unused to expressing such feelings. Because when I look at you and your son, I see a chance to be part of something that matters. Grace's eyes softened, and she reached out to touch his hand lightly. You're an unusual man, Quentin Tucker. Just Quinn, he said. My friends call me Quinn. She smiled for the first time since he'd rescued her, a genuine smile that transformed her face despite the bruises. Then I'll call you Quinn, since I hope we are friends. We are, he assured her, turning his hand to clasp hers briefly. More than that, we're allies now. They remained at the hidden spring for the remainder of the day, recovering their strength and planning their next move. The mine, according to the coordinates in Grace's locket, was located in Apache territory about 3 days' ride to the northwest. We'll need supplies, Quentin said, and I promised Samuel I'd bring you back to him. I need to see my son, Grace agreed, her voice thick with emotion. But I can't endanger him or the people of Cottonwood Springs by returning there openly. After discussion, they devised a plan. They would circle back toward Cottonwood Springs, but Grace would remain hidden outside town while Quentin went in to fetch Samuel and necessary supplies. Then they would head for the mine, hopefully before Powell learned of the failure of his hired guns and sent more men after them. They set out at dusk, riding through the night to avoid being spotted. By dawn, they had reached a wooded area about 5 miles from Cottonwood Springs. There, in a small clearing beside a creek, Grace would wait while Quentin continued on to town. Be careful, she said as he prepared to leave. Powell may have men watching the town. I'll keep my eyes open, Quentin assured her, checking his revolver before returning it to his holster. And I'll bring Samuel to you by nightfall. Grace caught his hand as he turned to go. Quinn, she said softly, thank you for everything. He nodded, momentarily unable to speak past the emotion her touch evoked. Then he mounted his horse and rode toward Cottonwood Springs, leaving Grace to wait and worry in the sheltered clearing, approaching the town cautiously. Quentin detected no sign of strangers or trouble. The main street looked much as it had when he'd left, with only the usual activity of a small frontier settlement. Still, he remained alert as he rode directly to the boarding house. Mrs. Winters answered his knock, her face lighting up at the sight of him. Mr. Tucker, you're alive, and... Is Grace? She's safe, he confirmed in a low voice. Waiting outside town, we've come for Samuel. Relief flooded the older woman's features. Thank God, the boy has been asking for both of you constantly. She ushered Quentin inside, closing the door firmly behind him. But there's something you should know. 2 men arrived in town yesterday, asking questions about Grace and Samuel and about a cowboy who might have gone looking for them. Quentin tensed. Powell's men? I believe so. They didn't stay long. The sheriff returned yesterday afternoon, and they seemed anxious to avoid him, but they could return. All the more reason to leave quickly. Is Samuel ready to travel? I can have him ready in 10 minutes, Mrs. Winters assured him. He has few possessions. But you look like you could use a meal and fresh clothing yourself. Quentin couldn't deny it. His shirt was blood-stained, his body grimy from days on the trail. I would appreciate that, madam, and I need to purchase supplies as well, while Mrs. Winters prepared Samuel and packed a small bag for him. Quentin washed quickly and changed into a clean shirt she provided. Then, leaving instructions for her to bring Samuel to the stables in half an hour, he headed to the general store. Miller seemed unsurprised to see him, merely nodding as Quentin entered. Figured you'd be back one way or another, he said. Found the Reynolds woman, I did, Quentin confirmed, selecting supplies from the shelves: coffee, flour, beans, jerky, ammunition. She's safe for now, but we need to move on quickly. Miller lowered his voice. Those men who were looking for her 2 more came through yesterday. Nasty types. Sheriff Thompson ran them off, but they didn't go far, been camping just outside town limits. Quentin's hand moved instinctively to his gun. Where exactly? North side, near the old Lynch place, abandoned farm about a mile out. How many? Just the 2 I saw, could be more. Quentin considered this information. The North Road was not the direction they planned to take, but it was concerning nonetheless. I appreciate the warning. After paying for his supplies, Quentin headed to the livery stable, where he arranged for a gentle mare for Grace and Samuel to ride together. The stable boy was just finishing saddling it when Mrs. Winters arrived with Samuel in tow. The boy's face lit up at the sight of Quentin. Quinn, he cried, running forward to be swept up into Quentin's arms. Did you find Mama? I sure did, partner, Quentin said, his throat tight with emotion. And she can't wait to see you. She's waiting for us not far from here. Samuel hugged him fiercely. I knew you would find her. I prayed every night, just like Mrs. Winters showed me. Quentin exchanged a glance with Mrs. Winters over the boy's head. Those prayers helped a lot, he said seriously, after thanking Mrs. Winters and promising to send word when they were safely settled somewhere. Quentin lifted Samuel onto the mare, mounted his own horse, and led them out of town by the south road, away from where Miller had said Powell's men were camped. Once they were well clear of Cottonwood Springs, Samuel could barely contain his excitement, peppering Quentin with questions about his mother. Quentin answered as honestly as he could without frightening the boy, telling him that his mother had been in trouble but was now safe, and that they were going to help her stay that way. As the sun began to set, they approached the clearing where Grace waited. Quentin called out as they drew near, not wanting to startle her. Grace, it's Quinn. I've brought someone who's mighty anxious to see you. A moment later, Grace emerged from the trees, her face transforming at the sight of her son. Samuel. She cried, running forward as Quentin lifted the boy down from the horse. Samuel flew into his mother's arms with a sob of joy, and Grace sank to her knees, holding him tightly, her face buried in his hair. My baby, my sweet boy, she murmured, tears streaming down her face. I was so afraid I'd never see you again. Quentin dismounted and stood back, giving them their moment of reunion. Watching them together, something shifted in his heart, a longing he'd suppressed for years, a desire for connection, for family, for a place to belong. After a time, Samuel pulled back to look at his mother's face, his small hand gently touching the fading bruise on her cheek. The bad men hurt you, he said, his voice quavering. I'm all right now, Grace assured him. Mr. Tucker Quinn saved me. He's a hero, just like in your stories. Samuel turned to look at Quentin with shining eyes. I knew he would save you. When he found me crying in the dust and lifted me up, I just knew. Grace met Quentin's gaze over her son's head, her eyes filled with gratitude and something more, something that made his heart beat faster. So did I, she said softly. From the moment Mrs. Winters told me about the cowboy who had found my son and gone to find me, I had hope again. They made camp in the clearing, building a small fire for warmth and cooking a simple meal. Samuel, exhausted from the excitement, fell asleep soon after eating, curled up in a blanket beside the fire. Grace tucked the blanket more securely around him, then came to sit beside Quentin at the edge of the firelight. He looked so peaceful, she said, watching her son sleep. I've missed him so much. He missed you too, Quentin said. Talked about you constantly. He's a strong boy. Like his father, Grace said with a sad smile. Robert was a good man, principled. He believed in justice, in doing what was right even when it was difficult. She glanced at Quentin. He would have liked you. Quentin felt a pang of something like jealousy, which he immediately recognized as inappropriate. Of course Grace would still love her husband, still mourn him. He sounds like someone worth admiring, he said carefully. Grace was quiet for a moment. I loved Robert deeply, she said at last, but our marriage wasn't. It wasn't what either of us had hoped for. She looked down at her hands. He was a businessman first, a husband second, always working, always pursuing the next opportunity. Even after Samuel was born, he was rarely home. I'm sorry, Quentin said, unsure what else to say. Don't misunderstand, Grace said quickly. He was kind, generous, he provided well for us, but there was always a distance between us that neither of us knew how to bridge. She sighed. When he discovered Powell's fraud, it became an obsession for him. Finding justice for the Apache, exposing Powell, it consumed him entirely. I barely saw him in the months before his death. And then you were left alone to deal with the consequences, Quentin observed. Grace nodded. Powell came to the house after the funeral, all sympathy and concern on the surface, but I could see the calculation in his eyes. He wanted to know what Robert had told me, what evidence I might have. When I claimed ignorance, he became threatening. That's when I took Samuel and ran. You're very brave, Quentin said, admiration clear in his voice. Not brave, Grace corrected. Desperate. I would do anything to protect my son. That's its own kind of bravery. They sat in companionable silence for a while, watching the fire burn down to embers. Finally, Grace spoke again, her voice soft in the darkness. "What about you, Quinn? You've heard my story, but I know nothing about yours." Quentin stirred the embers with a stick, watching the sparks rise. "Not much to tell. Grew up on a small farm in Tennessee. Left home at 16 after my parents died of fever. Fought in the war for a while, then drifted west. Been working cattle drives, doing odd jobs, moving on when the mood strikes. No family, no one waiting for you somewhere." He shook his head. "No one." "Never stayed in one place long enough to put down roots." "Why not?" Grace asked, her gaze steady on his profile. Quentin considered the question, one he'd rarely asked himself. "I suppose I never found a reason to stay anywhere. Always felt like whatever I was looking for was somewhere else." "And what are you looking for?" He looked at her then, struck by the genuine interest in her eyes. No one had asked him such questions in years. "I don't rightly know," he admitted. "Purpose, maybe, something that matters." Grace's hand moved to cover his where it rested on the ground between them. "You've given me back my son and my hope for the future," she said quietly. "That matters, Quinn, more than I can ever express." The touch of her hand sent warmth spreading through him that had nothing to do with the fire. For a moment, he allowed himself to imagine a different life, one with roots, with purpose, with Grace and Samuel at its center. The image was so compelling, so right, that it frightened him with its intensity. Gently, he turned his hand to clasp hers briefly before withdrawing. "We should get some rest," he said, his voice rougher than he intended. "We have a long journey ahead of us." If Grace was disappointed by his withdrawal, she didn't show it. "You're right," she agreed, rising to her feet. "Good night, Quinn, and thank you again for everything." As she moved to lie down beside Samuel, Quentin watched her, a mixture of emotions churning within him. He'd come to her rescue on impulse, driven by a sense of rightness he couldn't explain. Now he was committed to seeing her safely through this danger, to helping her find the evidence that would free her from Powell's threats forever. But what then? Would he ride away, as he always had before? Or was there a possibility of something more, something he'd never dared to hope for? Settling down to take the first watch, Quentin found himself praying once more, not just for their safety, but for clarity about the future that seemed to be unfolding before him, a future he hadn't known he wanted until Grace Reynolds and her son had entered his life. The journey to the mine took 4 days rather than the 3 they had anticipated. Traveling with a child required frequent stops, and they moved cautiously, always alert for signs of pursuit. Despite these challenges, the days passed pleasantly. Samuel, delighted to be reunited with his mother and fascinated by Quentin, filled the hours with chatter and questions. Quentin found himself enjoying the boy's curiosity, answering his endless queries about horses, tracking, and life as a cowboy. Grace watched their interactions with a soft smile, occasionally joining in but often simply listening, her expression thoughtful. In the evenings, after Samuel had fallen asleep, Grace and Quentin would talk in low voices beside the fire. She told him more about her life before growing up in St. Louis, the daughter of a respected doctor, meeting Robert at a social function, their courtship and marriage. Quentin, in turn, shared stories of his own past memories of his parents' farm, his experiences during the war, the vast landscapes he'd traversed in his years of wandering. With each conversation, the connection between them deepened, a growing understanding and appreciation that neither acknowledged directly but both felt keenly. Quentin found himself looking forward to these quiet moments, to the sound of Grace's voice, to the way her eyes reflected the firelight. On the morning of the 5th day, they reached the foothills where, according to Grace's calculations, the disputed mine was located. The terrain was rugged, with pine forests giving way to rocky slopes and deep ravines. They proceeded carefully, Grace consulting the locket frequently, interpreting its cryptic markings to guide their path. By midday, they had reached a high ridge overlooking a secluded valley. In the distance, the entrance to a mine shaft was visible, a dark wound in the mountainside. "That's it," Grace said, pointing. "The last chance mine." "Doesn't look like much," Quentin observed, studying the abandoned operation through his field glasses. "The visible workings are minimal," Grace explained. Robert said the real value was deeper in the mountain, a vein of gold so pure it would make men kill to possess it. Men already have killed for it, Quentin reminded her grimly. He scanned the area surrounding the mine entrance, seeing no signs of recent activity. Looks abandoned. No fresh tracks, no smoke from campfires. Powell believes only I can interpret the locket, Grace said. He wouldn't know where to look without me. They made their way down into the valley, approaching the mine entrance cautiously. Samuel rode with his mother, unusually quiet, sensing the tension in the adults. The entrance was partially collapsed, requiring them to dismount and proceed on foot. Quentin tied the horses to a sturdy pine, then helped Grace and Samuel navigate the debris. We should leave Samuel here, Grace said, looking uncertainly at the dark tunnel beyond the entrance. No, Samuel protested, clinging to his mother's hand. I want to stay with you, Quentin crouched down to eye level with the boy. Samuel, I need your help. Someone needs to stay out here and watch for anyone coming. You'd be our lookout. That's a very important job. Samuel considered this, his small face serious. Like a scout. Exactly like a scout, Quentin confirmed. If you see or hear anyone coming, you hide in those bushes over there. Don't let them see you. Can you do that for us? The boy nodded solemnly. I can do it. I'll be brave. I know you will, Quentin said, ruffling his hair. We won't be long. Leaving Samuel positioned where he could see both the approach to the mine and the entrance itself, Quentin and Grace ventured into the tunnel. Quentin led the way, a lantern held high to illuminate their path. The air was cool and damp, thick with the smell of earth and minerals. Robert said the evidence was hidden where the lie began, Grace murmured, her voice echoing slightly in the confined space. The main office would be deeper in, where the original surveys and claims would have been processed. They proceeded carefully, the tunnel widening in some places and narrowing in others, occasionally branching off in different directions. Grace navigated with surprising confidence, referring to her locket when they reached intersections. Eventually, they came to a larger chamber that had clearly served as an administrative center. Desks stood covered in dust, filing cabinets rusted in corners, maps hung askew on walls. This is it, Grace said, looking around, but where would he have hidden it? They began a methodical search, examining every drawer, cabinet, and possible hiding place. Quentin focused on structural elements, loose floorboards, hollow walls, anything that might conceal documents. After nearly an hour of fruitless searching, frustration began to set in. Are you sure this is the right place? Quentin asked. Grace stood in the center of the room, turning slowly, her eyes narrowed in concentration. It has to be, where the lie began. The lie was the fraudulent claim. The original claim would have been filed here in this office. Her gaze fixed suddenly on an old safe in the corner, partially hidden behind a fallen shelf. There, she said, moving toward it. The company's safe. All official documents would have been stored there. Can you open it? Quentin asked, joining her as she knelt before the heavy iron box. I think so, Grace said, studying the combination lock. Robert once mentioned that Powell used the same combination for everything his wife's birthday. She twisted the dial carefully. April 14, 1842. To their surprise, the safe opened with a metallic groan. Inside were several leather-bound ledgers and a stack of dusty papers. Grace pulled them out, quickly scanning each document. These are supply inventories, payroll records. She paused, her expression sharpening as she examined a thick envelope sealed with wax. This is it. Breaking the seal, she withdrew a sheaf of papers. The top document was a letter written in a firm hand that Grace recognized immediately. Robert's writing, she confirmed, reading quickly. It's all here, the original Apache treaty showing their ownership of the land. Documentation of how Powell falsified surveys to claim it. Even correspondence between Powell and territorial officials he bribed to overlook the fraud. Quentin whistled softly. That's more than enough to bring Powell down. And look at this, Grace said, extracting a second letter. Robert wrote this the day before he died. It's addressed to the territorial marshal, explaining everything and naming James Harrington as a witness to Powell's confession of the fraud. Harrington? Quentin frowned. The man with the scarred face, Grace nodded grimly. Robert's letter says Harrington worked for both of them but switched his allegiance to Powell after being paid to keep quiet about the fraud. He must have told Powell about Robert's plans to expose him. And Powell had your husband killed before the letter could be delivered, Quentin concluded, the pieces falling into place. Then sent Harrington after you when he realized the evidence and the map to the gold were missing. Exactly, Grace said, carefully returning the documents to the envelope. With this, we can finally expose Powell and clear Robert's name. A sudden noise from the tunnel made them both freeze. Samuel, Quentin called, reaching for his gun. No answer came. Instead, they heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps approaching multiple sets. Hide, Quentin whispered urgently. Extinguishing their lantern, Grace clutched the envelope to her chest, quickly sliding behind a large filing cabinet. Quentin positioned himself beside the entrance to the chamber, gun drawn, ready to confront whoever approached. The footsteps grew louder, and then a beam of light cut through the darkness. "I know you're in here, Mrs. Reynolds," called a voice neither of them recognized. "And your cowboy friend, too. There's nowhere to run this time." Quentin tensed, calculating their options. The chamber had only one entrance the way they had come in. Fighting their way out would be difficult, especially if they were outnumbered. "Powell sends his regards," the voice continued. "He's very disappointed that Harrington failed to bring you in. He's even more disappointed to learn that you've been digging around in his mine." Two men appeared in the entrance, both armed, their faces illuminated by the lantern one carried. Neither was familiar to Quentin, but their stance and the confident way they held their weapons marked them as professional gunmen. "We can do this the easy way or the hard way," the first man said, stepping further into the chamber. "The easy way is you both come with us now, bringing whatever you found in here. The hard way. Well, Powell didn't specify that you had to be in good condition when we deliver you." Quentin remained silent, waiting for the men to move further into the room, giving him a better angle to attack. "The boy told us you were in here," the second man added with a cruel chuckle. "Smart kid, knowing when to cooperate." At the mention of Samuel, Grace gasped involuntarily. The sound drew the men's attention toward her hiding place. "Ah, there you are, Mrs. Reynolds," the first man said, moving toward the filing cabinet. In that moment, Quentin acted. Lunging from his position, he slammed into the second man, sending the lantern crashing to the floor where it sputtered but continued to burn. In the confusion, he managed to knock the man's gun from his hand, but the first gunman turned quickly, aiming at Quentin. A shot rang out, but it wasn't from the gunman's weapon. From the entrance to the chamber, a new figure appeared, Sheriff Thompson from Cottonwood Springs, his revolver still smoking. "That's enough of that," Thompson said as the first gunman clutched his wounded shoulder, dropping his weapon with a cry of pain. Behind the sheriff stood a familiar face, Mrs. Winters, looking determined despite her obvious fear. And clutching her skirts, wide-eyed but unharmed, was Samuel. "Mrs. Winters came to me the day after you left town," Sheriff Thompson explained as he efficiently disarmed and restrained both gunmen. "Said she was worried about Powell's men returning. When they did, I was ready for them. Followed them when they left town in a hurry yesterday." "Samuel," Grace cried, rushing to her son and gathering him into her arms. "Are you all right? Did they hurt you?" "I'm okay, Mama," Samuel assured her. "I hid like Quinn said, but they found me anyway. Then Sheriff Thompson and Mrs. Winters came." Mrs. Winters stepped forward. "I couldn't bear the thought of you all facing such danger alone," she explained. "When I told Sheriff Thompson everything I knew about the situation, he agreed to help." "These two aren't the only ones Powell sent," Thompson added. "There are 3 more camped about a mile from here. My deputy's keeping an eye on them, but we should move quickly if we want to avoid another confrontation." "We found the evidence," Grace said, holding up the envelope. "Everything needed to prove Powell's fraud and his involvement in my husband's death." Thompson nodded grimly. "That'll be enough to take to the federal marshal in Santa Fe. He's been looking for something solid on Powell for years. The man's got a reputation for shady dealings, but he's been too clever to leave evidence until now." With the immediate danger contained, they made their way back to the surface, the 2 captured gunmen bound and under Thompson's watchful eye. Outside, the afternoon sun was beginning its descent toward the western horizon, casting long shadows across the valley. "My deputy and I will take these men and the evidence to Santa Fe," Thompson said after they had discussed their options. "Mrs. Winters has offered to accompany us to provide additional testimony about the events in Cottonwood Springs." "And what about us?" Grace asked, her arm protectively around Samuel's shoulders. Thompson considered. "It might be safer if you weren't in the territory until Powell's been arrested. Once he learns his men have failed again and that we have the evidence, he'll be desperate." "We could head south," Quentin suggested. "I have a friend with a small ranch near the border. He'd take us in until this is resolved." Grace looked up at him, a question in her eyes. "Us?" Quentin met her gaze steadily. "If you'll have me along," he said. "I'd like to see this through to the end." The smile that illuminated her face was answer enough. The journey to Quentin's friend's ranch took nearly a week. They traveled cautiously, taking side trails and avoiding towns where Powell might have eyes watching for them. Samuel, resilient as children often are, treated the journey as a grand adventure, especially with Quentin teaching him about tracking animals and identifying plants along the way. As for Grace and Quentin, the time together only strengthened the connection that had been growing between them. Without the immediate pressure of pursuit, they were able to talk more freely, to learn each other's stories in greater detail, to discover shared values and complementary differences. One evening, as they camped in a sheltered grove beside a small stream, Samuel already asleep nearby, Grace broached a subject they had both been avoiding. "What will you do after this is over?" she asked, her voice soft in the firelight. "After Powell is brought to justice." Quentin poked at the fire with a stick, watching the sparks rise into the night sky. "I haven't thought that far ahead," he admitted, though it wasn't entirely true. He had thought about it, had thought of little else, in fact. "You'll go back to the cattle drives, to drifting." There was something in her tone, disappointment, perhaps, or resignation. Quentin was quiet for a long moment, gathering his courage. "I don't think so," he said finally. "That life, it doesn't hold the appeal it once did." "Oh," Grace looked at him, a cautious hope in her eyes. "What's changed?" He met her gaze across the fire. "I have," he said simply. "Or maybe I've just remembered something I'd forgotten, that there are things worth staying for." Grace's breath caught audibly. "Quinn." "I don't have much to offer," he continued quickly, before his courage failed him. "No land, no fortune, just my hands and my heart. But if you and Samuel wanted, if you'd be willing to let me try to build something with you." He trailed off, uncertain how to articulate the feelings that had grown within him since the day he'd found a crying child in the dust. Grace moved around the fire to sit beside him, her hand finding his in the darkness. "Samuel adores you," she said softly. "And I." She hesitated, then continued with quiet certainty. "I've come to care for you deeply, Quinn, more than I thought possible after Robert." "I know I'm not him," Quentin said, a trace of insecurity in his voice. "No, you're not," Grace agreed, "and that's as it should be. Robert was a good man in his way, but what I feel for you is different, deeper somehow, more complete." Her hand tightened on his. "You didn't just rescue me and my son. You've given me hope for a future I'd stopped believing was possible." Quentin turned to face her, his free hand rising to gently touch her cheek. "I've been wandering most of my life," he said, his voice rough with emotion. "But when I found Samuel, when I found you, I felt like maybe I'd finally found what I'd been looking for all along." Grace leaned into his touch, her eyes shining in the firelight. "And what was that?" she whispered. "Home," Quentin said simply. "Not a place, a feeling. Belonging somewhere with someone." Her smile was radiant as she leaned forward, closing the distance between them. Their kiss was gentle at first, tentative, then deepening with shared longing and newfound certainty. When they finally parted, Grace rested her forehead against his. "I've been praying," she confessed. "Every night since you found Samuel, praying for safety, for justice. But also for this, for you to feel what I was beginning to feel." Quentin smiled, remembering his own prayers that had begun the day he'd lifted a crying child from the dust. "Seems like someone was listening," he murmured. They arrived at the ranch of Quentin's friend, Carlos Mendoza, 2 days later. It was a modest operation, a small adobe house, a barn, corrals for horses and cattle, and a bunkhouse for the handful of men who worked the place. Carlos, a man Quentin had once helped out of a difficult situation involving cattle rustlers, welcomed them warmly, offering his home without question when Quentin explained their circumstances. For the next 3 weeks, they waited for news from Santa Fe. Grace helped Carlos's wife, Elena, with household tasks, while Quentin worked alongside the ranch hands, grateful for the chance to contribute. Samuel thrived in the rural setting, following Quentin everywhere, absorbing knowledge like a sponge and charming everyone with his cheerful nature. In the evenings, they would gather on the porch, watching the sunset paint the desert landscape in vivid colors. Sometimes Carlos would play his guitar, Elena would sing, and they would all join in the simple pleasure of music and companionship. In those moments, Quentin would look at Grace and Samuel, at the family he had found so unexpectedly, and feel a contentment he had never known before. Word finally came in the form of a letter delivered by a passing stage driver. Sheriff Thompson had reached Santa Fe with the evidence, and federal marshals had immediately issued a warrant for Howard Powell's arrest. When they arrived at his St. Louis office to serve it, however, they discovered Powell had fled, taking whatever valuables he could carry. For 3 days, the news cast a shadow over their newfound happiness. If Powell had escaped justice, would they ever truly be safe? Would they spend their lives looking over their shoulders, waiting for him to reappear and threaten them again? Then, on the 4th day, a rider appeared at the ranch, a federal marshal named Davis, trail worn and dusty but bearing news that would change everything. "Powell's dead," he announced without preamble after introducing himself. "Tried to book passage on a ship to Europe. Got into an altercation with a dock worker in New Orleans. Shot the man, then was himself shot by a Port Authority officer. Died on the spot." The news brought a complex mix of emotions. Relief, certainly, that the threat was finally over, but also a strange sense of anticlimax, and for Grace, a lingering sadness that Robert's death had led to more violence, more lives destroyed by greed. "What happens now?" she asked the marshal. "The evidence, the mine." "The territorial governor has reviewed the evidence and declared the mine rightfully belongs to the Apache tribe, as per the original treaty," Davis explained. "As for the rest, there will be an official inquiry into Powell's other business dealings and the circumstances of your husband's death, but that's largely a formality now. The governor asked me to inform you that Robert Reynolds' name has been cleared of any wrongdoing, and that a statement to that effect will be published in major newspapers." "Thank you," Grace said quietly, tears of relief and vindication in her eyes. "There's more," Davis continued, reaching into his coat to withdraw an official-looking document. "In recognition of Robert Reynolds' efforts to expose the fraud and uphold the treaty rights of the Apache people, the territorial government has granted a parcel of land to his widow. 500 acres, about 50 miles north of here. Good land, I'm told, water rights included." Grace accepted the document with trembling hands. "I don't know what to say," she murmured, overwhelmed by this unexpected turn of events. Davis tipped his hat. "Justice comes in strange ways sometimes, madam, but it does come eventually." After the marshal departed, Grace, Quentin, and Samuel sat together on the porch, the land grant spread out before them as the setting sun bathed everything in golden light. 500 acres, Quentin said softly, still scarcely believing it. "That's a sizable ranch with the right management." "It's more than I ever expected," Grace agreed, her hand finding his as it often did these days. "A fresh start. Our fresh start." Quentin asked, the question carrying all his hopes for the future. Grace smiled, leaning into his shoulder. "Yes," she said simply. "Ours." Samuel, who had been listening quietly, looked up at them both. "Are we going to live there?" he asked. "All of us together?" Quentin met Grace's eyes, seeking confirmation. At her nod, he turned to the boy. "Would you like that, Samuel, if I stayed with you and your mother, if we built a home together?" Samuel's face lit up. "Yes, and you could teach me to be a cowboy, and we could have horses, and—" He paused, a sudden thought occurring to him. "Would you be my pa?" The question, so direct and honest, caught Quentin by surprise. He looked at Grace, uncertain how to respond. "If that's something you both want," she said softly, "it's something I want too." Quentin felt a swell of emotion so powerful it nearly overwhelmed him. "I'd be honored, Samuel," he managed to say. "Nothing would make me prouder than to be your pa." 2 months later, on a crisp autumn day, Grace Reynolds became Grace Tucker in a simple ceremony held on their new land. Samuel stood proudly beside them, holding the rings on a small cushion. Carlos and Alina Mendoza were there, along with Sheriff Thompson, Mrs. Winters, and a handful of others who had helped them along their journey. The house was still under construction, a sturdy log cabin that would serve until they could build something more permanent. But the barn was completed, horses and a few cattle already grazing in nearby pastures. The beginnings of a home, of a life together. As Quentin slipped the ring onto Grace's finger, he thought of the path that had led him to this moment. A chance encounter with a crying child in the dust, an impulsive decision to help, a journey that had changed everything. "I love you," he said softly, the words still new enough to fill him with wonder. "And I love you," Grace replied, her eyes shining with happiness. "Thank you for finding us." As they sealed their vows with a kiss, Samuel cheering beside them, Quentin silently offered one more prayer, a prayer of gratitude for the family he'd found, for the love he'd never expected, for the home he'd finally discovered. The journey had been long and fraught with danger, but it had led him exactly where he was meant to be with Grace and Samuel, building a future filled with promise and possibility. In the years that followed, the Tucker Ranch flourished. Under Quentin's management and Grace's practical wisdom, their herd grew, their crops thrived, and their reputation for fair dealing spread throughout the territory. Samuel grew into a fine young man, as skilled with horses as his father and as principled as both his fathers had been. They added to their family a daughter, Hope, born a year after their wedding, and later, twin boys who kept them all on their toes with their energy and mischief. The love between Quentin and Grace deepened with each passing year, strengthened by shared challenges and joys, by the life they built together. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the children were asleep, and they sat together on the porch watching the stars emerge, Grace would remind Quentin of that fateful day when he found a crying child in the dust, and in lifting him up, found the mother he had been praying for without even knowing it. "God works in mysterious ways," she would say, her head resting on his shoulder, and Quentin would smile, his arm tightening around her waist, his heart full beyond measure. "That he does, my love, that he does."